To the outside world, Kaliningrad is simply part of Russia. It's the country's furthest western exclave, meaning it's essentially Putin's gateway to the rest of Europe. And before the war in Ukraine, it was home to a substantial Russian military presence. But the winds of change are blowing in Kaliningrad. The region is evolving from being an important part of Russia, especially in terms of its access to the Baltic Sea, into the potential catalyst for a war that may engulf the Baltic states and, by extension, the rest of Europe. Kaliningrad is on the verge of becoming Ukraine 2.0. And as with any sequel, the possibility is that the fight over and in Kaliningrad could be bigger, scarier, and more all-encompassing than the battle in Ukraine has been so far. At its worst, Kaliningrad could become the unwitting trigger for World War III. How? That's the question we aim to answer in this video. But before we dive into what makes Kaliningrad such an important scrap of territory, it's worth learning a little more about what it is and, crucially, what it represents to Russia. Kaliningrad's history dates back to 1255 and the rise of the Teutonic Order. In their quest to Christianize as much of Europe as possible, that order took the territory that would become Kaliningrad as part of the Baltic Crusades. Naming it Königsberg, the territory soon became home to thousands of German settlers who spent the next few centuries setting up in Königsberg and establishing it as a separate state. Still, that state had a heavy Germanic influence, meaning it was never truly independent. And that lack of independence was exacerbated by the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Königsberg was essentially absorbed into East Prussia during this period, with Germany maintaining direct control over the region throughout both world wars. That's where the Soviet Union comes into play. After the Soviet Union played its part in defeating the Axis powers and ending World War II, it took part in the creation of the Potsdam Agreement. That agreement set new territorial boundaries within Europe, with Königsberg officially passing into Soviet hands. With 1946 came annexation and the region being split between Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, the former also being under the full or partial Soviet control at the time. And it was rechristened Kaliningrad in honor of the former head of the Soviet state, Mikhail Kalinin. For the next 45 years, Kaliningrad essentially functioned as an exclave of the Soviet Union. The region was turned into an oblast, an administrative division of the Soviet Union and later Russia, and Moscow banned access to the territory for foreigners. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought with it new possibilities for Kaliningrad, though any hopes of it becoming an independent territory were soon dashed when Moscow retained its control over the exclave. It retained its position as an oblast, with control over the region proving crucial to Russia. Not only could Kaliningrad serve as its furthest western territory in Europe, potentially leading to it serving a diplomatic purpose, but it also gave Moscow access to warm water ports during the winter. However, the separation between Kaliningrad and Russia started to become problematic. Kaliningrad is around 676 miles away from Moscow, and it's separated from Russia by both Lithuania and Poland, which encircle the territory. Everything that Russia does in Kaliningrad must go through one of those two countries, usually Lithuania first. It has access to the water thanks to its ports in St. Petersburg, but as those ports regularly freeze over during the winter, that access is somewhat restricted, often leaving Russia reliant on the cooperation of other countries to access Kaliningrad. Therein lies a problem for Moscow, as well as a hint toward one of the reasons why Kaliningrad is on the verge of becoming Ukraine 2.0. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kaliningrad has operated as a special economic zone, in which there are no import duties and extremely low taxes. That's allowed it to build economic ties with other European countries, including the Baltic states. It's heavily reliant on Moscow. 100 trains pass through Lithuania every month to supply Kaliningrad before the outbreak of the Ukraine war, but it also operates somewhat independently of Russia itself. That near independence leads us to the first reason why Kaliningrad is gearing up to become Ukraine 2.0. Many in the territory want it to become its own state. That was made clear during the National Online Referendum on Self-Determination of National Republics, held between February 16th and February 28th, 2023. The referendum was an online poll organized by several activist groups located within and outside of Russian territory. Its results were unofficial. Russia would never approve of such a poll, as even the concept of one of its oblasts wanting to gain independence is a potential sign of Russia's disintegration in the mind of President Vladimir Putin. Still, it happened, despite attempts to shut it down, and the results showed a clear design for independence inside Kaliningrad. A staggering 72.1% of the voters said they wanted freedom, compared to just 27.9% who said they wanted to remain part of Russia. Again, this was an unofficial poll, meaning it doesn't trigger anything that could lead to Kaliningrad actually gaining its independence, but it offers a clear answer to what some analysts dub the Kaliningrad question. The question is simple: what happens to Kaliningrad now that it's essentially isolated from Russia thanks to the Baltic states surrounding it not only becoming independent but also becoming members of the European Union? The poll result is just the latest demonstration of the strength of a growing movement within Kaliningrad for the region to cut its ties with Russia. And it exemplifies the feeling of many within the territory that it's essentially an island, that it's not only cut off from Russia but also hindered in efforts to build stronger relationships within Europe because of its ties to Moscow. That's the opinion of Alexei Shabunin, a journalist with a Kaliningrad news website named Russian West, who points out that those in the region who love Russia have always felt isolated. But now, with the outbreak of war in Ukraine, there is a general feeling of being locked in. The feeling is exacerbated by the fact that Russia has been more than happy to call on Kaliningrad's citizens to fight in Ukraine. According to the military newspaper Stars and Stripes, 5,000 of the 1 million people who live in Kaliningrad had been called up by December 2023, with 450 losing their lives. Outwardly, the exclave has also been supporting Russia's war efforts by providing clothes, camouflage nets, and quadcopters, in addition to providing a large portion of its 2024 budget to fund the war effort. But privately, Shabunin says most in the region just want it all to be over. People try to avoid the topic of the special military operation. They try to live like before. He also points to a lack of trust in the region's authorities, pointing out that many don't believe their leaders when they say they will defend Kaliningrad from being overrun if Russia declares war on the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Instead, they believe the exclave will be turned into rubble, undefended unless it's able to free itself from Russia and ally with the countries around it. We start to see a clear parallel between Kaliningrad and Ukraine here. Like Kaliningrad, Ukraine used to be under Soviet control. It was part of the Soviet Union for around 70 years before its 1991 collapse. After that, Ukraine gained its independence. Kaliningrad didn't. And if Ukraine's independence and Russia's desire to reclaim the territory was a trigger for the crisis we're seeing today, Kaliningrad's desire for independence could serve the same purpose. Should the exclave free itself from Russia, it might only be a matter of time before Putin, or whoever comes after him, attempts to reclaim it. Of course, it's not just Kaliningrad causing problems here. Lithuania will also play a role in Kaliningrad becoming Ukraine 2.0. Earlier we discussed how Kaliningrad is essentially locked away from Russia, with Lithuania having served as Moscow's main point of access for decades. That wasn't a problem before the Ukraine crisis. Russia was generally able to ensure the travel of both citizens and cargo through Lithuania and into Kaliningrad without issue. The war changed all of that. As a response to Russia's actions, Lithuania has repeatedly banned Russian travel through its territory. Its parliament voted to impose the Law on Imposing Restrictive Measures regarding the military aggression against Ukraine in 2023, creating a year-long ban on most Russian citizens from gaining visas to enter the country. The law was extended in April 2024 to run for at least another year, meaning Russia won't have ground-based access to Kaliningrad until, at best, May 2, 2025. Lithuania has also happily participated in the sanctions imposed on Russia since the outbreak of war. It's a clear supporter of Ukraine. It's provided about $500 million in financial aid to the country since February 2022, and it has its own history with Russia. Like Ukraine before it and Kaliningrad currently, Lithuania also fell under the Soviet yoke in the wake of World War II, only gaining its independence upon the collapse of the Soviet Union. In essence, it, along with the other Baltic states, has established itself as a clear enemy of Russia and Putin's aggressive tactics in Ukraine. It's also restricted access to Kaliningrad by preventing Russians from traveling to the oblast via land. They instead have to rely on a seaborne route from St. Petersburg, which is affected by the cold temperatures mentioned earlier. In the context of Kaliningrad becoming Ukraine 2.0, Lithuania's actions present two issues. First, they serve to further isolate Kaliningrad from Russia, which may have an interesting impact on the oblast's population. After all, there's already a clear and growing pro-independence movement. Given that Kaliningrad is supported directly by Russia, that movement could grow even larger as conditions deteriorate in the oblast. Its residents might increasingly feel that the prospect of essentially becoming a fourth Baltic state would serve it better. At least then, it will be able to expand its relationships in Europe, perhaps to the point where it follows Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in becoming a member of the EU and NATO. There's a major upside for Kaliningrad here, especially as Lithuania's sanctions and travel restrictions on Russia begin to cause more problems in the region. Second, Lithuania has angered Russia with this move, raising the possibility of Russia declaring war on it and the other Baltic states in response. That would lead to a somewhat indirect Ukraine 2.0 situation. Russia wouldn't be declaring war on Kaliningrad. It already owns the region, but it would declare war on the country that's preventing it from accessing that territory, potentially bringing the other Baltic nations into the fight, and due to Lithuania's NATO membership, creating a wider global conflict. All over Kaliningrad. It's also worth expanding on this concept of Kaliningrad becoming the fourth Baltic state. That's essentially what would happen if it were to gain independence from Russia, and some countries are already treating the region as an independent territory, at least in name. Countries like Poland. In May 2023, Poland decided that it would no longer refer to Kaliningrad by that name in any of its official documentation. Instead, it'll call the region Królewicz, the name it had when it was ruled by the Kingdom of Poland during the 15th and 16th centuries. That decision adds a further wrinkle to the tale. Some could argue that this appears to be a direct act of aggression by Poland, with the name change suggesting that it might have designs on claiming Kaliningrad as its own. That isn't the case, at least according to the country's development minister Waldemar Buda, who says the decision was made to prevent Russification in Poland. We do not want Russification in Poland, and that's why we have decided to change the name in our native language of Kaliningrad and the Kaliningrad region, he said when explaining Poland's decision. Either way, Russia is furious. The Kremlin described the decision as a hostile act, likely because it clearly serves as an indirect question of Russia's control over Kaliningrad. Again, we see fuel being poured onto the fire of the oblast's independence movement. After all, if one country is willing to recognize Kaliningrad as a separate entity, even in name only, there's a chance that others could follow suit. That's the last thing that Putin wants. So we have several reasons why Kaliningrad could become Ukraine 2.0 in the coming years. The growing independence movement in the oblast represents a clear threat to Moscow that Putin will want to put down. Lithuania and its decision to restrict Russian travel through its territory isolate Moscow further from Kaliningrad, perhaps feeding into the region's independence movement while angering Putin. Then there's Poland's naming decision, a hostile act that only feeds into the idea of Kaliningrad becoming an independent region. Now let's switch focus to another issue, the Baltic Fleet. We've already touched on one of the reasons why Kaliningrad is such an important territory for Russia. The oblast's port city, Baltiysk, is the only port Russia has on the Baltic Sea that doesn't ice over when the winter comes. It's where Russia stations its Baltic Fleet. In 2008, the most recent year for which we have figures, that fleet numbered 55 combat ships of varying types. These included several destroyers, corvettes, and frigates, along with landing ships and a pair of submarines. The fleet roughly represents about a tenth of Russia's entire naval power, and it needs constant support in terms of resources and personnel to be effective. Enter Lithuania's decision to ban Russians from traveling through its territory again. Not only does that decision hinder Russia from delivering supplies to the people, but it also has an impact on the Baltic fleet stationed in the oblast. Again, we point to St. Petersburg and the fact that its ports ice over in the winter. When that happens, the Baltic fleet is essentially cut off from Moscow, ending up stuck in the only warm water port that Russia has in the Baltic Sea. Worse yet for Russia, being cut off from Kaliningrad reduces its ability to keep control over the Baltic Sea. That's especially the case now that Finland, another old rival of Russia's, has become a NATO member. With that membership granted, NATO has extended its own border along the Baltic Sea, leading some to start calling the small stretch of water a NATO lake. A lake that NATO could use to even further isolate Kaliningrad from Russia. What does that have to do with Ukraine? Russia found itself in a similar situation with Ukraine several years before it invaded the country. As Kaliningrad is host to the Baltic Fleet, so too was Sevastopol home to the Black Sea Fleet further south. Sevastopol is in the Crimean region, which created a problem for Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed. Crimea went to Ukraine, with Kyiv then potentially having a claim over the former Soviet Union's Black Sea Fleet. Russia wasn't about to hand over a large chunk of its navy to a country that was now independent of it, resulting in a compromise being reached in 1997, the Partition Treaty on the Status and Conditions of the Black Sea Fleet. Under that treaty, 9 out of every 11 ships in the Black Sea Fleet were given back to Russia, with the remaining 2 staying with Ukraine. While that may seem to be a bad deal for Ukraine, because it was, the country was strapped for cash at the time of the treaty's signing. So in return for the lopsided deal, Russia promised to pay Ukraine $526 million. However, there was something that Russia wanted even more than the ships: the Sevastopol base in which the Black Sea Fleet was docked. Russia couldn't buy that base outright, it was part of Ukraine, but it could rent the base from Ukraine, giving it access to another crucial warm water port while also ensuring its Black Sea fleet actually had access to the sea that gave it the name. Russia inked another deal with Ukraine, this time promising to pay $97 million per year to rent the base, while at the same time promising to respect the sovereignty and independence of the new Ukrainian state. We all know how that worked out. But why did we get to this point where Russia invaded Ukraine? The simple answer is that Russia had a problem. Its Sevastopol base lease wasn't permanent. Toward the end of 2008, Putin found himself dealing with Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko, Ukraine's president and prime minister respectively, and crucially, both pro-West politicians. They announced that when 2017 arrived, Russia would have to leave Sevastopol, handing the base back to Ukraine. But there was another twist in the tale. In 2010, Yushchenko was ousted by Viktor Yanukovych, meaning the Ukrainian presidency was anti-West again. Wasting no time, Yanukovych extended Russia's lease at Sevastopol until 2042, once again securing Russia's access to the Black Sea. All was well for Russia again, until the 2014 Maidan Revolution saw Yanukovych flee Ukraine, placing the lease in danger once more. This time, Putin wasn't going to sit back and take the potential loss of a valuable base. Instead, taking advantage of the chaos the revolution caused, he chose to annex Crimea, claiming Sevastopol as Russian territory in the process and getting rid of the whole leasing issue. It's here where the parallels with Kaliningrad become clearer. When Russia annexed Crimea, Ukraine retaliated by blocking Russian land access to the Crimean Peninsula, thus preventing the country from transporting anything to its Black Sea fleet by land. It's almost a mirror image of what Lithuania has done to Russia in relation to the Baltic fleet. At first, Russia navigated around this restriction by ferrying troops and equipment into Sevastopol via the Kerch Strait. But that approach had limitations, resulting in Russia taking a second option: construction of the Crimea Bridge. Opened in 2018, the bridge allows cars, trucks, and in 2020, freight rail passengers to access Sevastopol without having to worry about Ukraine's land restrictions. Interestingly, we see the importance of that bridge in Russia's movements throughout Ukraine since the war began. It's pushed south heavily toward Mariupol because it needs that land to complete the Crimea Bridge. The importance of this bridge is also the reason why Ukraine has targeted it numerous times. It's already launched 2 attacks against the bridge, with an April 2024 report published in The Guardian suggesting that a third attack is inevitable. Taking out that bridge would force Russia to transport its war supplies through southern Ukraine, perhaps hindering Moscow's forces on the ground by slowing down their access to supplies. But let's bring things back to the situation in Kaliningrad. Right now, Russia faces a similar problem to the one it dealt with when it took Crimea. It owns the land, but it doesn't have access to it. And in the case of Kaliningrad, it can't get around the lack of access by building a new bridge. It needs to go through Lithuania, a country that's imposed heavy sanctions on Russia due to the war in Ukraine. And perhaps Putin might decide that the only way to regain full access to Kaliningrad will be to take Lithuania, getting rid of the sanctions issue in the process. And make no mistake, Russia wants to keep control of Kaliningrad. Not only is it the site of the Baltic fleet, but it's also home to several of Russia's Iskander missiles. Those missiles are capable of carrying nuclear payloads. Given Kaliningrad's positioning, remember that it's the furthest Russian territory that reaches into Europe, Putin will want to maintain access simply so he can use Kaliningrad to make nuclear threats should he need to. Still, there's one saving grace that might prevent Putin from launching any attacks against Lithuania that would restore its access to Kaliningrad, akin to the annexation of Crimea. Lithuania is a member of NATO. That membership means that Lithuania benefits from Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which says that any attack on a NATO member's land is considered an attack on all NATO members. It's the Three Musketeers principle, all for one and one for all, expanded to a global scale. If Putin were to attack Lithuania, it wouldn't just be Lithuania that he would have to fight. He would drag the United Kingdom into the war, France, Germany, Latvia, and Estonia, Lithuania's Baltic neighbors, and most importantly, the United States. None of those countries have directly intervened in the war in Ukraine because Ukraine isn't a NATO member. They've been limited to sending money and supplies, but if Russia launched an attack on Lithuania, they're duty-bound to respond militaristically, which could ignite a Third World War. So the Kaliningrad situation rests on a knife edge. It's still Russian territory, with the fact being unlikely to change, even though the independence movement within the exclave is growing stronger by the month. It also offers disturbing parallels to Ukraine, particularly in the sense of how Kaliningrad mirrors the issues Russia had with the Sevastopol base in terms of land access. Moscow is even having to deal with some countries, Poland key among them, starting to treat Kaliningrad somewhat like an independent state. But there are key factors that might stay Putin's hand. NATO is the obvious one. Russia likely doesn't have the appetite for a global war that would draw in its strongest enemy, making it unlikely that he would attempt to take Lithuania to restore ground access to Kaliningrad. Then there's the uncertainty over the Ukraine war and what its aftermath might look like to consider. If Russia wins, would it then be able to rebuild its relationship with the Baltic states to the point where free travel to Kaliningrad is in its reach once more? Only time will tell. For now, we'll turn things over to you. How important a role do you believe Kaliningrad will play in global geopolitics in the years to come? Do you think that Putin would risk starting another world war, turning Kaliningrad into Ukraine 2.0, just to restore land-based access to his Baltic fleet? Let us know what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Russia will lose Kaliningrad, or click this other video instead.